22 years, $2 trillion spent, 1 million Iraqi lives lost. And the architect who drew the plans just admitted on camera that the entire operation was designed to fail from the beginning. Professor Mohammed Marandi sat across from a Western journalist and calmly dismantled 3 decades of official narrative in under 90 minutes. What he revealed isn't speculation. It's a framework that explains every American intervention since the Cold War ended. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The bill for Iraq didn't end when American troops withdrew. Your tax dollars are still flowing into private security contracts, infrastructure that was built, then destroyed, then rebuilt, and permanent military installations that were supposed to be temporary. The war that officially ended in 2011 has cost American taxpayers an additional $400 billion in the years since. Every bridge bombed and rebuilt. Every power station destroyed and reconstructed. Every police force trained, then dissolved, then trained again. The contract money flows to the same corporations regardless of whether the mission succeeds or fails. And Professor Marandi just explained why that's not a bug in the system. It's the core feature. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to leave out. If this kind of analysis matters to you, the kind that connects dots mainstream outlets won't touch, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. What Professor Marandi laid out in this interview isn't getting airtime on cable news. It's not being discussed in Foreign Affairs magazine. It's happening here. And if you want to understand the actual strategic calculations driving Western foreign policy instead of the sanitized version, you need to be here for what comes next. Let me show you exactly what Professor Marandi revealed and why it rewrites the entire narrative you've been told about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. On November 14th, Marandi gave an interview that has been systematically suppressed across major platforms. Not banned, not flagged, just quietly kept out of recommended feeds and search results. The interview runs 73 minutes. In it, Marandi, who serves as a political analyst and advisor to Iranian negotiating teams, walks through a historical framework that flips the accepted story. He doesn't claim the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. He argues it accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. And the official goals, the ones repeated in every presidential address and Pentagon briefing, were never the actual goals. Here's what he said, and I'm quoting directly from the transcript. The destruction of Iraq as a functioning state was not collateral damage from poor planning. It was the intended outcome from day one. A broken Iraq cannot challenge Israeli regional dominance. A broken Iraq cannot control its own oil pricing. A broken Iraq becomes a permanent market for Western reconstruction contracts and military hardware. You don't spend $2 trillion and fail to achieve a single stated objective by accident. You achieve different objectives, unstated ones. Let that land for a second. The official story is that America went into Iraq to remove weapons of mass destruction, then to remove Saddam Hussein, then to establish democracy, then to prevent civil war, then to fight ISIS, then to ensure stability. Every single one of those goals either didn't exist as stated or was actively undermined by American policy decisions on the ground. The weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. Saddam was removed, but the state apparatus was dissolved, guaranteeing chaos. Democracy was announced, but sectarian divisions were institutionalized into the constitutional structure. Civil war was supposedly prevented, but militias were armed by the same forces claiming to pursue peace. ISIS emerged directly from the power vacuum and prisoner networks created by the occupation, and stability never came. But here's where Marandi's framework clarifies what looks like failure. If the goal was a strong, stable, independent Iraq that could govern itself and control its resources, then yes, every single policy was catastrophically wrong. But if the goal was permanent dependence, permanent instability, and permanent inability to challenge regional power structures dominated by Washington and its allies, then almost every decision makes perfect sense. The dissolution of the Iraqi army in May 2003, the de-Baathification program that removed every competent administrator, the decision to disband police and intelligence services, the construction of a government structure designed to enshrine sectarian conflict into the political system, the refusal to secure weapon depots or borders, the strategic tolerance of militia formation. Every single one of these decisions was presented as a mistake, a misjudgment, or an unintended consequence. Marandi argues they were structural choices with clear outcomes. Now here's what the Pentagon is leaving out of every retrospective analysis. Paul Bremer, the American administrator who ran Iraq in the first year of occupation, issued a series of orders that fundamentally restructured the Iraqi economy. Order 39 opened Iraq to full foreign ownership of Iraqi businesses except for oil. Order 40 completely rewrote Iraqi tax and banking laws. Order 81 criminalized Iraqi farmers saving seeds from one harvest to plant the next, effectively creating dependence on foreign agricultural corporations. These weren't temporary emergency measures. They were permanent structural changes, and they were implemented while Iraqi representatives had zero input and zero ability to challenge them. Bremer left Iraq in June 2004. Those orders remain in effect today. That's not nation building. That's economic colonization with a military perimeter. And then came the oil contracts. Iraq has the fifth largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 145 billion barrels. At current prices, that's roughly $12 trillion in the ground. Under Saddam, Iraqi oil was controlled by the Iraqi state. Production levels were set by Baghdad. Prices were negotiated by Iraqi officials. Revenue stayed in Iraqi government accounts. After the invasion, the oil contracting structure changed. International oil companies were brought in under production sharing agreements that guaranteed them a percentage of oil revenue regardless of global price fluctuations. The contracts ran for 20 to 30 years. And here's the key detail. The pricing mechanisms and production levels were now subject to international approval, not unilateral Iraqi decision-making. Marandi points to this as the tell. If you want to control a country, you don't annex it. You don't plant a flag and declare it a colony. You create dependent structures that look like partnerships but function as extraction systems. Stay with me because the next part connects Iraq to every intervention that followed. Professor Marandi didn't just analyze Iraq in isolation, he mapped the pattern. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. 4 countries, 4 interventions. 4 official narratives about humanitarian goals, spreading democracy and fighting terrorism, and 4 outcomes that look identical when you strip away the marketing language. Broken states, permanent instability, resource extraction by foreign actors, and military presence that never fully withdraws. The operational model is consistent. Take Libya. Official story, NATO intervened in 2011 to prevent Muammar Gaddafi from massacring civilians in Benghazi. Humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect. The intervention lasted 7 months. Gaddafi was killed, and then NATO left Libya to govern itself, right? Wrong. Libya today is split between 3 rival governments, multiple militia factions, 2 separate central banks, and oil facilities controlled by whichever armed group happens to hold the territory that week. Libyan oil production before the intervention, 1.6 million barrels per day. Libyan oil production today, 1.2 million barrels per day, but now sold under contracts negotiated during the chaos that favor European buyers. Libyan gold reserves before intervention, 143 tons, intended to back a pan-African currency. Libyan gold reserves after intervention, unaccounted for. And Europe's migrant crisis, which destabilized European politics for a decade, flows directly from the collapse of Libyan state border controls that happened when NATO removed the government. If the goal was a stable, peaceful, democratic Libya, the intervention failed completely. But if the goal was to prevent an independent Libya from challenging French and Italian energy interests in Africa, from launching a gold-backed currency that could compete with the dollar and euro in African trade, and from controlling Mediterranean migration routes, then the intervention succeeded on every front. Marandi's framework says, look at the outcomes, not the press releases. The outcomes reveal the intent. Now let me show you the number that explains this entire strategy better than any diplomatic statement. The math is brutal. America has spent $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East since 2001. That's the Brown University Cost of War Project estimate, and it includes direct military spending, veterans care, and interest on borrowed war funds. $8 trillion over 22 years. The result, 0 stable democracies established. 0 terrorist organizations permanently eliminated. ISIS replaced Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda replaced the Taliban. New groups emerged from every power vacuum. But here's the other side of the equation. American defense contractors, reconstruction firms, and private security companies have been paid over $2 trillion from that $8 trillion in direct contracts. Lockheed Martin alone received over $400 billion in defense contracts during the War on Terror period. Halliburton and its subsidiaries, $39 billion. DynCorp, over $4 billion. Blackwater, rebranded as Academy, over $1 billion. The equation is this: $8 trillion spent. $2 trillion goes to private contractors. The wars don't end. The instability continues. The contracts renew. If you're a defense contractor, a failed war that continues indefinitely is more profitable than a successful war that ends. A stable Afghanistan doesn't need ongoing security contracts. A broken Afghanistan needs them forever. A rebuilt Iraqi power grid doesn't need constant repair contracts. A power grid that gets blown up every few years and needs rebuilding generates permanent revenue. Marandi argues this isn't accidental. It's a business model, and the evidence is in the contract structures. Here's what they're not telling you on cable news. Those production sharing agreements in Iraq, those oil contracts in Libya, those mining rights in Afghanistan, they all have something in common. They were negotiated during periods of chaos when no legitimate government had the capacity to negotiate fair terms, and they're structured to run for decades. The chaos isn't a failure of planning. It's the environment that enables the contracts. Think about what that means. If your goal is to sign a resource extraction deal that heavily favors your corporations, you need a weak government that can't negotiate effectively. You need ongoing instability that prevents any future government from having the legitimacy or capacity to renegotiate. And you need a permanent security presence to protect the extraction infrastructure. Every single one of those conditions requires the state to be broken, not fixed. Professor Marandi then connected this to the broader geopolitical chessboard, and this is where the China and Russia angles become critical. China's Belt and Road Initiative is building infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. High-speed rail, deep water ports, energy pipelines, manufacturing zones. And the model is different. China builds the port, operates it for 30 years under a lease agreement, then transfers ownership to the host country. China finances the project at low interest rates. The host country repays through trade facilitation or resource agreements, but the infrastructure remains. A Chinese-built port in Pakistan still functions as a port after the lease ends. Compare that to the American model Marandi describes. America doesn't build, it destroys, then contracts rebuilding to American firms, then the rebuilt infrastructure gets destroyed again in the next phase of conflict, then it gets rebuilt again. The infrastructure never stabilizes. The contracts never end. Now watch what happened when Iraq tried to pivot toward Chinese investment. In 2019, Iraq signed a memorandum of understanding with China for infrastructure development. Roads, bridges, hospitals, schools. The deal was structured as oil for infrastructure. Iraq would guarantee oil shipments to China, and China would finance construction projects. Within 6 months, protests erupted across Iraq. Not protests against the Chinese deal specifically, but protests against corruption and mismanagement that destabilized the government attempting to implement the deal. The protests were real. The grievances were legitimate, but the timing disrupted Iraq's ability to move forward with economic agreements that would have reduced dependence on Western contractors. Coincidence? Marandi suggests looking at the pattern. Every time a Middle Eastern country moves toward economic independence or deeper ties with China and Russia, instability follows. Russia is watching this closely and drawing its own conclusions. Moscow's intervention in Syria in 2015 was a direct response to the pattern. Russia looked at Iraq, Libya, and the early phase of the Syrian conflict and saw the same formula being applied. Support armed opposition groups. Frame it as pro-democracy uprising. Wait for the government to collapse. Move in during the chaos to secure favorable economic terms. Russia said no. Not in Syria. Moscow committed air power and military advisors. The Syrian government survived, and today Syria remains broken, but it remains a state. Compare that to Libya, which has no functional government at all. Russia's calculation was straightforward. Allowing Syria to fall means the next target is Iran, then the instability reaches Russia's southern borders. Better to draw the line in Damascus than in Tehran or the Caucasus. China made a similar calculation. Beijing brokered the Saudi-Iran normalization deal in 2023. That agreement didn't happen because Saudi Arabia and Iran suddenly liked each other. It happened because China offered both countries something more valuable than continued hostility: economic integration into Chinese markets and infrastructure projects that don't require permanent conflict. The deal removed one of the key justification frameworks for American military presence in the Gulf, which is protection of Saudi Arabia from Iranian aggression. If Saudi Arabia and Iran aren't in a state of near war, what exactly are 50,000 American troops doing in the region? Protecting oil shipments? China is now the largest importer of Saudi oil. The protection argument collapses. Here's the dimension almost no Western analyst is discussing openly. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency depends on oil being priced in dollars. Every country that wants to buy oil needs dollars to do it. That creates permanent demand for dollars. That demand allows the United States to run massive deficits without triggering currency collapse, because the world needs to hold dollars for energy purchases. But if oil starts being priced in yuan or in a basket of currencies or in bilateral agreements that bypass the dollar, that structural demand weakens. And here's what Marandi points out. A stable, independent Iraq that controls its own oil pricing could choose to sell oil in currencies other than dollars. A broken Iraq with contracts negotiated under duress doesn't have that option. The contracts are dollar denominated. The same applies to Libya. The same applies to any major oil producer that loses the capacity to make independent pricing decisions. Let me show you where this goes next, because Professor Marandi made specific predictions with a clock attached. First prediction, within 18 months, you will see a major push to rehabilitate American involvement in Iraq through media retrospectives framing the invasion as a tragic mistake made with good intentions. The narrative will be that leaders were misled by bad intelligence, not that the operation achieved its actual goals. Watch for it. The rehabilitation is already starting. Second prediction, within 3 years, Iraq will face another major internal crisis that prevents the government from executing long-term economic planning, particularly anything that reduces dependence on Western contractors or deepens integration with Chinese infrastructure projects. The crisis will be framed as organic internal conflict, but the timing will align with Iraq's economic policy shifts. Third prediction, within 5 years, another Middle Eastern state will face the same intervention pattern. The justification will be humanitarian. The result will be state collapse. And the contracts signed during the chaos will run for 30 years. Now here's the question I want you to answer in the comments, and I read every single one. Which country is next? Yemen is already broken. Lebanon is on the edge. Which state do you think faces the next round of this pattern, and what will the official justification be? Drop your prediction below because the pattern doesn't stop. It adapts, and understanding the framework is the only way to see it coming. If this gave you a lens that connects 20 years of policy decisions into a single coherent strategy instead of a series of random mistakes, share this with one person who still thinks the Iraq War was just a well-intentioned failure. The conversation that needs to happen about Western intervention strategy is not happening in mainstream spaces. It's happening here, and it's happening because you're here. The next video goes into the economic mechanisms that make this pattern sustainable, how private military contractors operate, how reconstruction funds flow, and why the system doesn't correct itself even when the outcomes are obviously destructive. Subscribe so you're there when it lands. Because once you see the structure, every news story about the Middle East starts making sense in a way it never did before. And that clarity is something they don't want you to have.